I've been a photographer for more than 30 years. 12 years ago I turned professional as a wedding and portrait photographer. In my career so far, I've photographed around 500 weddings. I also run a busy portrait studio where I take photographs of children and families. And so far, I've done 4,000 shoots. They say that if you do a job that you love, then you'll never work a day in your life. And whilst I love my job, unfortunately along the way I lost my hobby and the enthusiasm that I had to take photographs for my own satisfaction rather than for someone else. How did this happen? Well, in this vlog I'm going to explore some of the reasons behind it and also how I managed to rediscover my hobby. I live in a small village called Kirkcowan, which is located in Dumfries and Galloway, southwest Scotland. The area surrounding me is one of natural beauty and has numerous habitats for native wildlife, including fields, hedgerows, forests, lochs and rivers. There's a large variety of wildlife here, which includes foxes, badgers, deer, otters, red squirrels, along with a huge array of birds. This provides me with a wide variety of options which are easily accessible to me in the small amount of downtime that I have, which is often in the quieter winter months and the summer evenings. So what went wrong? Well, I became so successful with my portrait and wedding photography business. So every weekend I was rushing from job to job, camera in hand, and then even when I wasn't actually taking photographs, there was so much work to do with post-production, getting client orders ready, designing wedding albums, correspondence, etc., advertising, marketing, and so it went on. And it just got to the point where I felt like picking my camera up, it became a bit of a millstone, and I just kind of got into the habit that I only picked my camera up if I was working. So this year, 2019, 12 years later after I started my business, I've decided to try and reinvigorate a passion for photography. I've chosen to do that by starting to do some wildlife photography. So it's not an area that I'm particularly experienced in, although obviously I'm technically competent in using camera and I understand the processes and post-production, etc., etc. So obviously that comes in really handy, but it's a completely different skill set in wildlife photography than it is with wedding and portrait photography. So in wedding and portrait photography, most of the time my subjects are quite willing. They've asked me to take their photographs, they'll respond to instruction, and ultimately I'm working with them to produce the images for them. And wildlife photography, that's completely different. Often your subjects, firstly you've got to find your subject. So fieldcraft really comes into this. You need to learn about the species that you're trying to photograph, where they might be found, their habitat, etc. The times of year, potential locations. It involves perhaps a bit of tracking, to try and see if there's activity in the area. So there's quite a lot goes into just finding the subject in the first place. It's as I found out, it's not just a case of walking out the front door and then there's a raft of wildlife for you to take photographs of. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the subjects themselves tend to be quite shy of human presence. So again, you need to work out how you're going to overcome this, and this can either be fieldcraft, through concealment, through sitting down in a location where you think that a particular animal species is going to be, and waiting for them to come to you. So this is completely different to my wedding and portrait photography, and it's quite nice in that respect because it's a different kind of pressure, if you can call it pressure. When I'm doing my commercial work, you know, I'm having to fulfill work to a high standard, to a brief. It has to be done within certain time constraints. Often it's not repeatable. If I head out with my camera to do some wildlife photography and I don't see any wildlife, then it's no harm done. It's been a nice walk in the countryside. So that's kind of some of the differences. Also, the equipment tends to be quite different for wildlife photography than it is for weddings and portraits. So in my wedding and portrait work, I use a lot of short telephoto lenses or prime lenses. With wildlife photography though, because you're taking photographs of something that's relatively shy and small, you're having to use much longer lenses. The lenses often are quite difficult to handhold, and that means that you have to employ the use of a tripod. And for me, this is something that I'm not used to. I very, very rarely use a tripod for any of my commercial work unless it's product photography. And having to carry that tripod around and think about the shot in advance so that you can get the tripod set up, get the lens and the camera mounted on it, and be in the position to take the resulting photograph this is something to think about, and more challenging than just being, holding a camera handheld and taking shots. So the other thing is cameras. For most of my work I use full frame cameras, but most of my wildlife stuff so far has been on a crop sensor D500, and I just love that camera just for the little bit of extra reach that it gives me. The autofocus system on it is fantastic, and it's just a great camera. So I'm using different bodies and lenses in wildlife photography compared to my professional work, and that's meant that I've had to buy a few extra bits and pieces, and that's great because, let's face it, who doesn't like buying new gear? My professional gear I've had for a number of years, and it does get refreshed, but typically it's the same kind of tried and tested gear, the same focal lengths that I always use. So the opportunity to try bigger lenses and master some of the techniques that are involved in using those, because it's so different from using the shorter focal lengths, that it did take a bit of getting used to, especially tracking birds in flight. When you're fully zoomed in, I lost count of the number of pictures of clouds that I've taken. But when you do get it, it's a great feeling. So I've got to a standard with my wedding and portrait photography that I've got a formula. I know pretty much what I'm doing and where I'm doing it. So for me, a lot of the challenge has gone out of that. It's like anything that you do a lot and you get reasonably competent at. Once it stops challenging you, it becomes less exciting. So certainly for me, the wildlife photography side of things, because it's a fairly new thing, there's plenty of challenges in it for me. Mainly finding and getting close to the animals. Quite often I'll sit at home in some downtime and I'll read through nature books, field guides, etc. I'll look over Ordnance Survey maps. I'll look at Facebook wildlife groups and see where people are seeing certain wildlife. that I might wish to go and photograph. So there's a lot that I can do at home, or when I've got some downtime, and then even on days where perhaps I'm not going out with the camera, I can walk around, I can scout locations, I can leave camera traps, and these are all things which you know, I was kind of missing with some of my other photography. So these challenges are just giving me a fresh perspective on photography and helping me get my enjoyment and love of it back. And I've always had a love of wildlife, so now the ability to kind of join those two together, I'm finding really worthwhile and a great reason to get out and about with my camera. So there's some of the reasons behind this adventure, and by no means am I an expert in wildlife photography, but I hope over the coming videos and vlogs to be able to share my journey with you, to pass on whatever information, tips and tricks, etc. that I found useful, and for you to kind of follow along the journey as I try and become a wildlife photographer. If you like this vlog, then don't forget to subscribe. Also hit the like button, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.